April 24th, 1944, 24,000 feet above Brandenburg. The oxygen mask fogged with each laboured breath as Major Georg Ral pressed himself back into the seat of his Messerschmitt Bf-109G-6, watching in disbelief as the American fighter maintained its pursuit through the diving turn. His earphones crackled with the panicked voices of Jagdgeschwader 11's finest pilots, men who had ruled European skies since 1940, men who had shot down hundreds of Allied aircraft, men who had survived 4 years of brutal combat, now crying warnings like novices facing their first engagement. Indian at 6 o'clock high, he's still with me at 400 kilometers per hour. How is he still with me? The voice belonged to Oberleutnant Klaus Neumann, a 23 victory ace who had never before sounded uncertain in combat. For 3 years, Ral had lived by an iron law of aerial combat, a law written in the blood of Allied bomber crews and validated by thousands of successful intercepts. American fighters couldn't follow German fighters home. They lacked the range. They lacked the altitude performance. They lacked the speed at height. This wasn't propaganda or wishful thinking, it was mathematical certainty, confirmed by fuel calculations, performance tables, and operational experience. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Yet the P-51B Mustang boring down on his wingman defied every assumption that had kept German pilots alive since 1941. Its Packard-built Merlin engine sang a death song at an altitude where American thunderbolts and lightnings had gasped for air, where German fighters had always possessed the advantage, where the thin air and sub-zero temperatures had been the Luftwaffe's ally. 600 miles from its base in England, this Mustang still had fuel for another hour of combat and the journey home. Ral's own fuel gauge showed 15 minutes to Brandenburg, barely enough to land, certainly not enough to fight. The mathematics of air superiority, distance, altitude, endurance had reversed in a single morning. The hunters had become the hunted over their own capital, over the very heart of the Reich that they had sworn to defend. What Major Ral witnessed that April morning was not merely a new American fighter, but the beginning of the Luftwaffe's systematic destruction. Within 1 year, the force that had terrorized Europe would lose 75% of its pilots, 90% of its experienced leaders, and complete air superiority over Germany itself. The transformation would be so complete that by war's end, German fighters would hide from American escorts rather than engage them. The weapon of this destruction was an aircraft designed in just 102 days, powered by a British engine, built in quantities that defied German comprehension, and flown by pilots who seemed to multiply faster than they could be shot down. But the P-51 was merely the visible manifestation of something the Germans had failed to understand: the awesome productive capacity of a fully mobilized democratic society. The crisis had been building since August 17, 1943, when the U.S. 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17 flying fortresses in a single day, attacking Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The twin raids were ambitious attempts to cripple German ball-bearing production and Messerschmitt fighter assembly, but the cost was catastrophic. Of 376 bombers dispatched, 60 failed to return a 16% loss rate that was unsustainable by any measure. The mathematics of the bombing campaign had reached a critical inflection point. American bombers were suffering 20 to 25% losses on deep penetration raids, while German fighter production was actually increasing despite the bombing. Every statistical projection showed the same grim conclusion: the bomber offensive would bleed to death before it could achieve its objectives. General Major Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, had reviewed the numbers with satisfaction in his headquarters at Berlin. The Americans were losing bombers faster than they could train crews. Each B-17 carried 10 men, 10 highly trained specialists who required months of preparation. A pilot needed 200 hours of flight training. A bombardier required intensive instruction in the Norden bombsight. A navigator needed celestial navigation skills. Radio operators, gunners, flight engineers, each position demanded specialized knowledge. The Luftwaffe was trading one fighter pilot for 10 bomber crew members, an exchange rate that favored Germany decisively. Even better, from the German perspective, the Americans seemed unable to solve the fundamental problem of range. Their fighters could escort bombers to the German border, but no further. Beyond that point, the bombers were defenseless. The Americans must turn back at Aachen. Galland had told his staff in September 1943, his finger stabbing at the map where the Rhine marked the practical limit of American fighter range. Their fighters lack the range to escort beyond the Rhine. We can therefore concentrate our forces, wait for the escorts to turn back, and then massacre the bombers at our leisure. The laws of physics are on our side. No fighter can carry enough fuel for deep penetration missions and still retain combat capability. The strategy was working with brutal effectiveness. On October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers and 650 men in another raid on Schweinfurt. The mission had achieved some tactical success, damaging ball-bearing production, but the strategic cost was prohibitive. The American bombing campaign ground to a halt for 4 months. No major raids penetrated deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe had seemingly won the battle for air superiority through the simple expedient of geography. German pilots celebrated what they saw as a decisive victory. They had proven that strategic bombing without fighter escort was impossible. The Americans would either abandon deep penetration raids or continue bleeding themselves white. Either outcome favored Germany. The confidence was understandable. It was based on sound reasoning, proven tactics, and the apparently immutable laws of aeronautical engineering. Unknown to the celebrating German pilots, an extraordinary convergence of engineering genius and industrial might was already reversing their victory. In factories across America, a solution was taking shape, a solution so elegant and effective that it would render obsolete every assumption upon which German air defense strategy rested. The North American P-51 Mustang had been born from a British requirement in April 1940, during the darkest days of the Battle of Britain, when England desperately needed fighters. The British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation with an urgent request. Could they build Curtiss P-40 fighters under license to supplement dwindling RAF numbers? North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmood, made a counter-proposal that seemed almost arrogant in its ambition. Instead of building an existing design, they would create an entirely new fighter, and they would do it in an impossibly short time frame. The prototype would fly in just 149 days from contract signature. It was designed in a mere 102 days, a development speed that would have been impossible in any other nation, a testament to American engineering prowess and industrial efficiency. The early results were mixed. Initially powered by the Allison V1710 engine, the Mustang Merc I proved exceptional below 15,000 feet, but disappointing above that altitude precisely where bomber escort was needed. The Allison engine, designed for low-altitude performance, lost power rapidly as air density decreased. At 25,000 feet, where German fighters operated comfortably, the Allison-powered Mustang struggled. But in April 1942, Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker flew an Allison-powered Mustang and immediately recognized its potential. The airframe was extraordinarily clean, efficient, fast at low altitude. Harker wrote in his report, "The aircraft's performance below 15,000 feet is remarkable. If fitted with a Merlin engine optimized for high altitude, this aircraft could be revolutionary." This marriage of American aerodynamics and British power would produce the war's most decisive fighter aircraft. The Merlin engine, developed by Rolls-Royce for high-altitude performance, featured a 2-stage supercharger that maintained power at altitudes where other engines faltered. The Packard Motor Company in Detroit had begun license production of the Merlin engine in August 1941, applying American mass production techniques to British precision engineering. The transformation was remarkable. Packard engineers didn't merely copy the Merlin, they improved manufacturing processes, increased production efficiency, and enhanced reliability. By late 1943, Packard was producing hundreds of Merlin engines monthly, each one delivering approximately 1,650 horsepower at altitude where German pilots had felt safest. The production volume alone was staggering. Packard would eventually produce over 55,000 Merlin engines, more than all British Merlin production combined. The transformation from mediocre high-altitude performer to dominant fighter was extraordinary. While the Allison-powered early Mustangs had struggled above medium altitude, the Merlin-powered P-51B became a high-altitude predator. At 25,000 feet, it was faster than the Bf-109G. At 30,000 feet, it could outrun, outclimb, and outmaneuver any German fighter. The Focke-Wulf FW-190, deadly at low altitude, found itself at a severe disadvantage against the Mustang at fighting altitude. Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, the American military attaché in London and former World War I pilot, had written a prophetic report in July 1942. The P-51, with the Merlin engine, will be superior to any existing fighter in the world above 25,000 feet. It will have the range to escort bombers to Berlin and back. This single aircraft could change the entire strategic situation in Europe. I cannot overemphasize the importance of this development. Hitchcock's prediction would prove conservative. The P-51B didn't just change the strategic situation, it reversed it entirely, transforming the air war from a battle the Allies were losing into one they would win decisively. The secret behind the Mustang's revolutionary performance lay not just in its engine, but in its aerodynamic design, specifically its laminar flow wing. This was cutting-edge aeronautical engineering, based on recent research by NACA National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, predecessor to NASA, into boundary layer behavior. In conventional wings, the boundary layer, the thin layer of air moving over the wing surface, becomes turbulent very quickly, creating significant drag. Edgar Schmude and his team designed the Mustang's wing to maintain laminar smooth, non-turbulent airflow to 60% of the wing's chord, compared to perhaps 20% for conventional designs. This seemingly small difference reduced drag by 30% compared to conventional designs. The practical effect was dramatic. Less drag meant higher speed and, critically, greater range. The Mustang could fly faster while burning less fuel, or cruise at efficient speeds for extraordinary distances. This single aerodynamic innovation provided the speed and range that made long-range escort possible. It was the kind of technical advantage that couldn't be easily copied or countered. It required fundamental understanding of advanced aerodynamics and precision manufacturing. German engineers studying captured Mustangs were incredulous. They understood the theory behind laminar flow wings but had never successfully implemented one in production. The tolerances were too tight, the manufacturing too difficult, the quality control too demanding. Yet here was an American aircraft, mass-produced in the thousands, that had mastered this difficult technology. The combination of low-drag airframe, efficient high-altitude engine, and internal fuel capacity created a fighter that could fly from England to Berlin, fight for 30 minutes, and return home. It defied everything the Germans understood about the necessary trade-offs between range, speed, and maneuverability. In fighter design, you were supposed to choose two of three, but the Mustang seemed to achieve all three. December 1st, 1943. A formation of Focke-Wulf for 190 seconds from Jagdgeschwader 2 approached American bombers near Solingen, confident the escorts had turned back. The pilots were veterans with thousands of combined victories, men who had fought over France, Britain, Russia, and the Mediterranean. They were executing a well-rehearsed attack pattern they had perfected over 18 months of unopposed attacks on unescorted bombers. Escort dropping away, reported Hauptmann Wilhelm Meyer, a Staffel leader with 43 victories, watching the P-47 Thunderbolts waggling their wings in farewell to the bombers. Americana returning to base. Beginning attack approach. Target the lead bombardment box. Standard tactics. But as the F-190 seconds rolled into their attack dive, urgent voices crackled through their radios, breaking through the usual combat discipline. Indians. Indians still with the bombers. New type. Maintaining escort. They're not turning back. 8 P-51B Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneer Mustang Group, had remained with the bombers. Their 75-gallon drop tanks had given them an extra 150 miles of range, enough to extend escort coverage deep into Germany. The German pilots, conditioned by 18 months of uncontested attacks on unescorted bombers, were psychologically unprepared for fighter opposition at this distance. The shock deepened on December 13, 1943, when the first major raid with substantial P-51 escort penetrated to Kiel 420 miles from the nearest Allied base. 16 P-51Bs of the 354th Fighter Group not only escorted the bombers, but engaged in aggressive fighter sweeps, hunting German fighters rather than waiting to be attacked. This was a fundamental tactical shift, from defensive escort to offensive fighter operations. Major Georg Peter Eder, commanding the 3rd, JG-1, encountered the Mustangs near Bremen. A veteran with 78 victories, Eder had developed specific tactics for each Allied fighter type. The P-47 Thunderbolt could be outmaneuvered at altitude. Its weight made it sluggish in turns. The Spitfire lacked range and couldn't sustain operations deep in Germany. The P-38 Lightning couldn't turn with German fighters and was vulnerable in vertical maneuvers. But the P-51 defied categorization. First contact at 7,500 meters altitude, Eder reported to Jagdkorps headquarters. Enemy fighters maintained speed and maneuverability superior to our Bf-109G at this height. Pursued my Staffel for 30 kilometers before fuel considerations forced us to land. Enemy continued escort mission without apparent fuel concerns. Request immediate intelligence assessment of this aircraft type. Oberfeldwebel Heinz Nocker, a 33 victory ace with JG-11, wrote in his diary on December 20th, "The appearance of American fighters over Hanover has shaken everyone. We used to take off leisurely when bombers approached, knowing we had time to gain altitude and position for the attack. Now we must climb immediately, or risk being bounced by escorts. They're already at altitude, already positioned, already waiting for us. The war has come to our doorstep. The psychological advantage we've enjoyed since 1940 has evaporated in a matter of weeks." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The P-51B's performance statistics, when German intelligence finally obtained accurate data in January 1944, caused disbelief at the highest levels of the Luftwaffe. Staff officers checked and rechecked the numbers, certain there must be errors or exaggerations. But the data was accurate. Speed, 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet faster than any German fighter at altitude. The Bf-109G could manage perhaps 406 miles per hour at best altitude. The FW-190 was even slower at height. The Mustang could simply run away from German fighters when it chose to disengage. Range, 1,650 miles with drop tanks more than double that of any German fighter. The Bf-109G had a combat radius of perhaps 350 miles. The W-190's range was even shorter. The implications were staggering. No target in Germany was beyond the reach of escorted bombers. Ceiling. 42,000 feet service ceiling higher than comfortable operating altitude for German pilots. Above 35,000 feet, German pilots struggled with cold, hypoxia, and engine performance. The Mustang could fight effectively at altitudes where German aircraft were barely controllable. Climb, 3,475 feet per minute, superior to the Bf-109G above 20,000 feet. This meant American fighters could gain altitude advantage and could pursue diving German aircraft. The vertical energy advantage belonged to the Mustang. Armament, 6, 50 caliber machine guns with 1,880 rounds, enough for extended combat. German fighters typically carried 1 or 2 20mm cannon with perhaps 200 rounds total, supplemented by machine guns. The Mustang could fire for longer periods without worrying about ammunition conservation. German intelligence officers studying these specifications understood immediately that the strategic situation had transformed. The technical superiority in specific areas, German cannon were more destructive than American machine guns. German fighters could outturn the Mustang, at some airspeeds were irrelevant against the Mustang's overwhelming advantages in the parameters that mattered: range, altitude performance, and speed at height. February 20th to 25th, 1944 Big Week brought the full weight of American air power against German aircraft production in a coordinated offensive, unprecedented in its scale and intensity. Over 1,000 bombers and 900 fighters, including 150 P-51's, struck aircraft factories across Germany in raids that flew in weather that would have grounded operations in previous years. For the first time, American fighters weren't merely escorting, they were hunting. The Luftwaffe lost 355 fighters during Big Week, but more critically, approximately 100 experienced pilots were killed, including dozens of formation leaders. These weren't inexperienced replacements, they were Staffelkapitane and Gruppenkommandeur, men with hundreds of combat missions, men who represented irreplaceable tactical knowledge accumulated over years of warfare. Their loss would cascade through the fighter force in ways that statistics couldn't fully capture. These were the men who knew how to lead formations through flak, who could read weather and predict bomber routes, who could position their units for optimal attacks. They were the teachers, the mentors, the institutional memory of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Their deaths left inexperienced pilots without mentorship, hastening the qualitative decline that would soon become catastrophic. The psychological impact of Big Week was devastating. German pilots who had spent years developing their skills now faced opponents with superior equipment, superior numbers, and increasingly superior training. The confidence that had carried the Luftwaffe to early victories evaporated in the face of relentless American pressure. For the first time, German fighter pilots entered combat expecting to lose. March 4th, 1944, marked a watershed moment that would resonate throughout Germany. The first American bombing raid on Berlin with full fighter escort. 660 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, escorted by P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, and P-47 Thunderbolts, darkened the sky over the Reich capital in a display of air power that Nazi propaganda had claimed impossible. Adolf Galland himself flew against the raid, leading a scratch force of Bf-109Gs pulled from training units and reserve squadrons. His after-action report to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was brutally honest, abandoning the usual euphemisms and optimistic projections. We were outnumbered 3-1 by escort fighters before we even reached the bomber stream. The Mustangs had altitude advantage, speed advantage, and tactical advantage. We managed to damage 3 bombers before being scattered by overwhelming fighter opposition. I personally was chased for 50 kilometers by 2 Mustangs who had fuel to toy with me like cats with a mouse. They could have shot me down at any time but seemed content to demonstrate their superiority. The appearance of American fighters over Berlin shattered the last pretense of German air superiority. Civilians who had been told the Luftwaffe was winning watched silver Mustangs flying loops over the Brandenburg gate, performing victory rolls over the heart of the Reich. The regime's credibility, already strained by military defeats on the Eastern Front and in Italy, crumbled further under this visible demonstration of American air power. If American fighters could reach Berlin, what couldn't they reach? Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels privately raged about the humiliation in his diary, but could find no effective counter-narrative. How could he explain to the German people that their vaunted Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe, was now powerless to defend the capital? The psychological impact extended beyond military circles to the entire German population. By April 1944, P-51 pilots had developed a devastating new tactic that exploited their range advantage to its fullest extent. After completing escort duties, seeing the bombers safely to target, and through the initial defense, they would descend to treetop level and strafe targets of opportunity on the return flight. German airfields, previously safe once Allied formations passed overhead, became killing grounds. April 13th, 1944, exemplified the new reality with devastating clarity. After escorting bombers to Schweinfurt, 42 Mustangs from the 4th Fighter Group descended on German airfields across Bavaria in coordinated attacks that demonstrated American tactical sophistication. In 30 minutes of concentrated strafing, they destroyed 51 aircraft on the ground, damaged 23 more, killed dozens of ground personnel, and destroyed irreplaceable maintenance facilities, including fuel stores, ammunition dumps, and repair hangars. German pilots now faced 3 distinct threats that covered the entire spectrum of air operations: combat in the air during bomber escort missions, aggressive fighter sweeps hunting them over their own territory, and devastating low-level attacks on their airfields. There was no sanctuary, no safe moment, no respite from American air power. Even landing after a mission was dangerous. Mustangs would wait for German fighters to be low and slow on final approach, then bounce them at their most vulnerable. The range advantage meant P-51 pilots could afford to be patient, aggressive, and creative in ways that were impossible for German fighters constrained by fuel limitations. They could loiter over German airfields, waiting for defenders to take off, then attack them during their climb to altitude. They could chase German fighters deep into enemy territory without fear of running out of fuel and being stranded. They could escort bombers to targets the Luftwaffe never dreamed American fighters could reach, from Polish factories to Czech armament works to Austrian oil refineries. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe faced a catastrophic pilot shortage that went far beyond simple numbers. Monthly losses exceeded 25% of operational strength, a rate that no air force could sustain, while training programs produced increasingly inferior replacements. The average German fighter pilot in 1944 received 110 to 160 flight hours before combat, compared to 400 hours for American pilots and the 220 to 250 hours German pilots had received in 1941. By early 1945, some German pilots entered combat with as little as 80 hours total flight time, barely enough to master basic flying, let alone aerial combat. They knew how to take off and land, perhaps how to fly formation, but they lacked the fundamental air combat skills that distinguished survivors from casualties: situational awareness, gunnery, energy management, tactical decision-making. They were sent against American pilots with 400 hours of training that included extensive gunnery practice against towed targets, formation flying in all weather conditions, instrument flying, navigation, combat tactics, and often transition training in the actual aircraft they would fly in combat. Many American pilots arrived at operational units with previous combat experience from other theaters. The qualitative gap was insurmountable. Oberst Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, commanding JG-77 and one of the Luftwaffe's most respected fighter leaders, documented the crisis in increasingly desperate reports to higher headquarters. "We received children as replacements. Boys of 19 with minimal training, who have never flown above 5,000 meters, never fired at a moving target, never experienced high-G maneuvers. Some have never even seen combat gun camera footage. We must send them against American pilots with 400 hours training, many with previous combat experience, flying superior aircraft. It is not warfare, it is murder." The quality differential has become a force multiplier for American effectiveness. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, who would score 21 aerial victories before being rotated home, observed the transformation with a mixture of professional satisfaction and human sympathy. By spring 44, half the German pilots we encountered were easy kills. They'd fly predictable patterns, fail to use clouds for cover, and panic when bounced. Some would just bail out at the first burst of fire. The old hands were still dangerous. You could tell immediately by how they flew, how they positioned themselves, how they used energy, but they were increasingly rare. Every month there were fewer of them. The strategic bombing campaign against German oil facilities intensified in May 1944 following the transportation plan that preceded D-Day, created an additional crisis that multiplied the P-51's inherent advantages. German aviation fuel production plummeted from 180,000 tons in April to just 20,000 tons by September, a catastrophic 89% decline that created cascading failures throughout the Luftwaffe. Training flights were curtailed, then eliminated entirely as fuel became too precious for anything except combat operations. Combat operations themselves were restricted to what the Germans deemed decisive engagements, which increasingly meant desperate defensive actions against overwhelming Allied air power. Pilots who once flew daily now flew weekly, losing the muscle memory and reflexes that kept them alive in combat. Skills eroded, reaction times slowed, confidence evaporated. Meanwhile, American pilots flew training missions over Germany itself, building experience in actual combat conditions without the full danger of committed opposition. P-51 groups would conduct fighter sweeps offensive patrols designed to find and destroy German aircraft that served double duty as training missions for new pilots. With unlimited fuel, American pilots could loiter over German airfields, waiting for defenders to take off, then attack them during their most vulnerable moments. The tactical situation had become completely asymmetric. German pilots began conserving fuel in ways that compromised combat effectiveness. They would avoid aggressive maneuvering that burned fuel quickly. They would break off engagements earlier than tactically sound. They would refuse to pursue American fighters that led them away from their bases. The psychological burden of fuel concerns added another layer to an already overwhelming disadvantage. The introduction of the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter in summer 1944 briefly raised German hopes for a technological solution to their problems. With a top speed of 540 miles per hour, the Me-262 was 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D, a speed advantage so overwhelming that, in theory, the jet could engage or disengage at will. Hitler saw it as a wonder weapon that would reverse the air war's trajectory, a testament to German technical superiority that would vindicate his faith in advanced weapons. But P-51 pilots quickly developed tactics to counter the jets, turning technological inferiority into tactical superiority through operational innovation. They would loiter near Me-262 airfields, which intelligence had identified and tracked, attacking the jets during takeoff and landing when they were slow and vulnerable. The Mustang's superior range meant they could wait patiently for opportunities, circling at safe distance until a jet committed to landing with low fuel. The Me-262's technological superiority was nullified by operational realities that no amount of engineering could overcome. The jets required high-grade fuel that was increasingly unavailable due to the bombing campaign against oil facilities. Their Jumo 004 engines needed complete replacement every 10 to 25 hours of operation, impossible with disrupted supply chains and bombed factories. Most critically, they required experienced pilots for effective operation. Pilots with the skill to manage the jet's unique handling characteristics and the tactical sense to exploit its speed advantage. But the Luftwaffe had few veterans remaining, and those who survived were being killed faster than they could train others. Notable Me-262 pilots like Oberleutnant Klaus Neumann, credited with shooting down 10 P-51 seconds, and Major Georg Ral, who claimed 9 P-51 seconds among his 12 jet victories, achieved individual successes that demonstrated the jet's potential. But these victories had no strategic impact. For every Mustang shot down, dozens more appeared. The production differential was simply too great, the numerical advantage too overwhelming. By autumn 1944, P-51 seconds had shifted focus from air combat to infrastructure destruction, becoming tactical weapons in a strategic campaign. Operating in squadron-strength units, they attacked locomotives, rail yards, bridges, and canal locks, with systematic thoroughness that paralyzed German logistics. The German economy, dependent on rail transport for moving everything from coal to military equipment, began systematic collapse under this assault. On September 11th, 1,944 36 P-51 seconds from the 357th Fighter Group destroyed 81 locomotives in a single day, demonstrating the scale and efficiency of these operations. The cumulative effect was devastating beyond the immediate physical damage. Coal couldn't reach power plants, causing electricity shortages that shut down factories. Parts couldn't reach factories, halting production of everything from tanks to ammunition. Food couldn't reach cities, creating civilian hardship that eroded support for continued warfare. The 357th Fighter Group would eventually claim 595.5 air victories, the highest number of any P-51 group in the 8th Air Force, while simultaneously destroying hundreds of locomotives and countless other ground targets. This dual capability, achieving air superiority while simultaneously destroying infrastructure, demonstrated the P-51's versatility and the comprehensive nature of Allied air power. Reich Minister Albert Speer, who managed Germany's wartime economy with ruthless efficiency, wrote in his diary with unusual candor, "The American fighters have achieved what the heavy bombers couldn't complete: transportation paralysis. Coal cannot reach power plants, parts cannot reach factories, food cannot reach cities. The systematic destruction of our rail network has severed the arteries of German industry. We can produce weapons but cannot move them. We can grow food but cannot distribute it. The end is inevitable." Beyond statistics and strategy, the P-51's dominance inflicted profound psychological trauma on German pilots that transformed their self-conception and combat effectiveness. Men who had entered service as elite warriors, who had been told they represented Aryan superiority, experienced complete demolition of their worldview. The Mustang pilots displayed a confidence that demoralized German opponents' confidence born of superior training, superior equipment, and the knowledge that reinforcements were always available. American pilots flew aggressive aerobatics over German cities, performed victory rolls over airfields they had just strafed, and dominated every engagement with overwhelming numbers and superior training. They acted like they owned German airspace because they did. The psychological impact of this reversal, from hunters to hunted, from predators to prey, cannot be overstated. German pilots developed fatalistic humor about their situation, gallows humor that masked deep demoralization and growing certainty that the war was lost. A joke circulated through fighter units: "What does a German fighter pilot need for an Iron Cross?" Answer: a P-51 escort to the cemetery. Another: "What's the difference between a German fighter pilot and a target? The target has a chance of surviving." The jokes were bitter acknowledgments of their predicament. April 7th, 1945, witnessed Operation Werewolf, one of the Luftwaffe's final large-scale missions, and perhaps its most desperate. Approximately 180 to 200 Bf-109 seconds, piloted mostly by inexperienced volunteers responding to appeals to patriotic sacrifice, attempted to ram American bombers in organized suicide attacks. The operation was conceived in desperation and executed with predictable results. American fighters claimed approximately 130 to 140 German aircraft destroyed while losing minimal numbers themselves. The suicide attacks achieved nothing except adding more names to the casualty lists. The Luftwaffe effectively ceased to exist as an organized fighting force after April 1945. Though aircraft and pilots remained, distributed across Germany in various states of readiness, the will to fight had evaporated. Unit commanders stopped ordering missions, knowing they would accomplish nothing except killing their remaining pilots. The once proud force that had terrorized Europe was reduced to hiding its remaining aircraft in forests and barns, hoping to preserve them for some imagined future need that would never come. The final statistics of the P-51's impact reveal the scale of transformation in stark numerical terms that speak to the completeness of Allied air superiority. Total P-51 seconds produced: 15,586 aircraft from 1,941 to 1,945. Enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat: 4,950 confirmed, with actual numbers likely higher due to unconfirmed kills. Enemy aircraft destroyed on ground: 4,131 confirmed, representing irreplaceable losses of aircraft that Germany couldn't replace. P-51's lost to all causes, 2,520, including operational accidents. Kill ratio, approximately 3.6 to 1 inch aerial combat, rising to over 5 to 1 if ground kills are included. German pilot losses on the Western Front tell a story of systematic decimation. In 1,944, over 8,000 killed or missing. In 1945, from January to May, over 3,000 killed or missing. The total fighter pilot force, which had numbered over 15,000 at its peak, was reduced to a fraction of that number. With survivors largely inexperienced and demoralized, Luftwaffe operational strength declined precipitously across the final 18 months of war. In January 1944, approximately 1,600 operational fighters. By June 1944, after Big Week and continued attrition, 1,480 operational fighters. In January 1945, as fuel and pilot shortages bit deeply, 1,000 operational fighters. By April 1945, in the war's final weeks, just 325 operational fighters remained, many grounded for lack of fuel or pilots. The training hours comparison reveals the quality differential that made numerical advantages even more decisive. American pilots in 1944–45 received 400+ hours before combat, including 20 hours of gunnery training. German pilots in early 1944 received 160 to 220 hours, with minimal gunnery practice. By late 1944, this had dropped to 110 to 160 hours. In 1945, some entered combat with as little as 80 hours total flight time pilots who would be easy kills for experienced American aviators. North American aviation's production miracle deserves recognition equal to the P-51's technical excellence. The company produced one completed Mustang approximately every 90 minutes at peak production, a rate that seemed impossible until it was achieved, then sustained for months. The Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas plants together employed tens of thousands of workers, with women comprising 40% of the workforce and performing every task from riveting to final assembly. This production achievement contrasted starkly with German manufacturing constraints. While exact German production figures remain disputed due to incomplete records and the chaos of the war's final months, it's clear that American fighter production far exceeded German capacity. The United States produced more P-51's alone, 15,586 aircraft, than Germany produced of all single-engine fighter types combined in 1944–45, a period when German production was supposedly maximized. The production differential reflected fundamental differences in industrial capacity, economic organization, and social mobilization. American factories operated multiple shifts with well-fed, adequately paid workers. German factories increasingly relied on slave labor, workers weakened by poor nutrition, and facilities disrupted by bombing. The productivity gap widened monthly. The American pilot training system proved as decisive as the aircraft itself, representing another dimension of systemic advantage. By 1944, the United States Army Air Forces operated one of history's largest educational programs, churning out thousands of pilots annually. Each pilot progressed through a standardized curriculum: primary training 65 hours, basic training 75 hours, advanced training 100 hours, and operational training 160+ hours. This systematic approach produced pilots who arrived at combat units with 400+ hours of flight time, including extensive gunnery practice, formation flying, instrument flying, navigation, combat tactics, and often transition training in the actual aircraft they would fly in combat. German pilots, by contrast, increasingly arrived at frontline units, barely able to handle their aircraft, let alone fight effectively. The systematic advantage in training, combined with superior equipment and overwhelming numbers, created an insurmountable disparity that no amount of individual courage or tactical skill could overcome. Military historians universally acknowledge the P-51's decisive role in achieving Allied air superiority. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the war with access to German records and personnel, concluded unambiguously, the P-51 fighter, more than any other single weapon, won air superiority over Europe. Without it, the daylight bombing campaign would have failed, D-Day would have been impossible, and the war would have lasted significantly longer. The P-51 made possible three critical achievements that shaped the war's outcome. First, the continuation of the daylight strategic bombing campaign after the near disaster of 1943. Second, the achievement of complete air superiority before D-Day, allowing Allied ground forces to operate without fear of air attack. Third, the systematic destruction of German transportation and oil infrastructure that paralyzed the German war economy. Each of these accomplishments was impossible without long-range fighter escort, but the P-51's influence extended beyond World War II into post-war thinking about air power and military effectiveness. It demonstrated conclusively that air superiority resulted from systemic advantages, training, production, logistics, and technology integration, not individual pilot skill or aircraft performance alone. The lesson was that modern warfare required not just good weapons, but the entire industrial and social infrastructure to produce, maintain, and employ those weapons effectively. Former Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland, interviewed extensively after the war, later admitted with the benefit of hindsight, the P-51 was not necessarily superior to German fighters in every individual aspect. In a one-on-one dogfight at certain altitudes and airspeeds, a skilled German pilot in a Bf-109 or TMW-190 could potentially prevail, but it was good enough in all aspects, produced in overwhelming numbers, flown by well-trained pilots, and supported by unlimited resources. This combination was unbeatable. We were fighting against an entire system, not just an aircraft. At a 1975 NATO conference on air combat history, General Günther Ral, who survived the war with 275 victories and later served in the post-war Luftwaffe, reflected on the P-51's impact with unusual candor. The Mustang didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed the very concept of air superiority as we understood it. We thought in terms of individual combat, pilot skill, tactical victories, the night in the sky concept that went back to World War I. The Americans thought in terms of systems, production, and strategic dominance. They were fighting a different kind of war, an industrial war, and they won because they understood warfare's true nature better than we did. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The Luftwaffe that had swept across Europe from 1939 to 1941, that had come within sight of victory over Britain in 1940, that had dominated the Eastern Front in 1941 to 42, was systematically destroyed by American industrial democracy, given wings and purpose. The P-51 Mustang was the instrument of this destruction, the visible manifestation of American power. But the true weapon was the society that produced it. A society capable of designing an aircraft in 102 days, manufacturing over 15,000 of them with consistent quality, training thousands of pilots to professional standards in systematic programs, and projecting this power across oceans to achieve total air superiority over an industrialized opponent. This was the reality the German pilots failed to comprehend until far too late. They had underestimated not just an aircraft, but an entire civilization's capacity for organized violence. The German pilots who dismissed American fighters in 1943 never expected the P-51 to crush the Luftwaffe because they never understood the nation behind it. They saw aircraft where they should have seen assembly lines stretching across continents. They counted pilots where they should have counted training programs that produced thousands of aviators monthly. They measured range where they should have measured industrial capacity, the ability to produce not just fighters but the fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and infrastructure to sustain them in combat. By the time they understood the true nature of American power, the depth of its industrial capacity, the breadth of its resource base, the efficiency of its training systems, the sustainability of its logistics, it was too late. The hunters had become the hunted, and the European skies belonged irrevocably to the Mustangs. The Luftwaffe's destruction was not just a military defeat, but a demonstration that free societies, fully mobilized and properly directed, could generate power beyond the comprehension of totalitarian systems that relied on coercion and slave labor. In the end, the P-51 Mustang proved that victory in modern war came not from warrior spirit or racial superiority, the myths that Nazi ideology had promoted, but from the mundane realities of industrial production, systematic training, and logistical excellence. It proved that free workers produced better weapons than slaves, that systematic training created better pilots than ideological indoctrination, that democratic societies could mobilize resources more effectively than dictatorships. The German pilots never expected to be crushed by the P-51 because they never expected to face the unlimited productive capacity of American democracy. They had been told that democracies were weak, divided, incapable of sustained effort. They learned, at terrible cost, that the opposite was true. When they finally understood, their understanding came from the wrong end of 6.50 caliber machine guns, high above the burning ruins of the Third Reich. As their fuel gauges showed empty, and American fighters had hours of fuel remaining. The 1,650-mile range they had ignored as impossible, dismissed as propaganda, or failed to take seriously, became the mathematical proof of their defeat. Distance didn't just matter in the abstract calculation of range and fuel consumption. Distance meant the difference between fighting over your own territory versus fighting over the enemy's. It meant the difference between breaking off when low on fuel versus pursuing to the kill. It meant the difference between defensive operations and offensive dominance. Distance meant everything, and the Germans learned this lesson too late to matter. The Luftwaffe aces had ignored the P-51's range advantage until Berlin raids made it undeniable. By then, German air superiority was already lost, the pilot pool already depleted, the fuel supplies already exhausted, the infrastructure already destroyed. The Mustang's range advantage had won the war in the air, and with it, the war itself. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.